Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the concluding question and answer session for the cultural history of the United States. I want to say, thanks to everybody who has submitted questions because I've enjoyed this. I think you too, Jeremy, have you enjoyed it?
I loved it.
Okay, great. Because I think it's been very insightful. And again, you asked questions that I wouldn't have thought of. And so and hopefully that's helpful for the listeners as well. I'd also like to thank the people who attended my first retreat here in France. So that was just finished this weekend. And so went very well. And I appreciate them very much. And all the people who asked questions at some point, probably there'll be another one, but TBD this spring, I would imagine. So anyway, stay tuned for that and lots of other exciting things. All right, Jeremy, hit me with questions from the whole series. This is the big wrap up. So we got a bunch of questions.
Yes. Ashton asked a question about socialism. He says, "Yo, Wes, come on, man. Why won't you explain in detail why you don't accept how much we need socialism right now, at least social democracy?" And in this thread, someone else responded to Ashton and said, "America is too diverse for socialism." And then someone responded to that person and said, "That doesn't even follow. Socialism is essentially radical democracy. It's literally the best system for a diverse society." So when I was listening to the lecture series, I kept waiting for kind of like a lefty prescription or something like that, because you were criticizing individualism and talking about individual rights. And I'm so used to people defending those kind of individualistic rights with the claim of you're a socialist. So what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, okay, so lots there. One important, so socialism, neither socialism nor communism have real clear definitions philosophically. So this is one of the tricky things here, but a rough, back of the envelope description is that in socialism, the means of production are shared, but private property exists. So you can own your own house, but you're not supposed to have like a stock market, right? The company should be communally owned rather than personally owned or privately owned. But you do have private property. You can own a house, you can own land, you can own a car, so on and so forth. In communism, because these are too often blurred together, there is no private property. All property is communal. So first, I always like to get those definitions out of the way a bit. And so it is totally possible to have public ownership of the means of production, which is, major factories and stores and these kinds of things. And of course, where you draw the line on what is a means of production, it turns out that as an economic concept, means of production is not very helpful. Basically, it's economically not that clear of a concept either. But if all the big business and stuff are communally owned, that does not mean you can't have a lot of individualism. Maybe even nearly as much as you could have in the United States. So socialism is, in theory, generally not actually that contrary to individualism. Except for it restricts the ability to own large companies or big producers of economic goods. So that being said, what people usually mean by socialism is that you have government participation in structuring society. And this is the problem that I run into as a conceptual field, is simply every government ever in history. So the US, if you call it as a government that's shaping society, look at the ways that the U.S. federal government and state governments and local governments interact in your life. I mean, it's so amazing that if you go back to, 1600s, they would not even understand this. Even if you go back 70 years or 80 years in the United States, just before the war, this is a radical increase in government participation in and interaction with your life. Now, conservatives or reactionaries would say, right, this is where we want to get individualism back, and we want the government to go away. The problem here is this is not necessarily individualism. So if the government provides you with, say, retirement benefits, then you don't have to rely on your children.
Mhm.
You don't have to rely on your neighbors. You don't have to rely on your church or some other institution to provide for you when you can no longer work. And so, on one hand, the capacity to be free individuals is largely built on this level of government support. So, if you think about all the things that the government helps you do, and if you had to do those for yourself, what you would do is you'd go back to communalism, or there'd be a strong impulse towards communalism. So I don't really like the categories of socialism and communism and as helping to sort this very well. I think a better one is to think of how involved and integrated we are with the people around us. And this can be an individual choice. One way that you could, sort of square this circle is to what other people refer to as like elective tribe, because you
Mhm.
don't choose your family, and we all know that families can be very helpful and supportive. They can also be a bit unhelpful and unsupportive. Mixed
Yeah.
record on the institution that is the family. And so the response to that is to say, give people the opportunity to choose their own communities, to create their own tribes. And so that's outside of government control. This is in Plato actually talks about this, and I can't remember where now. He says the first thing that a tyrant wants to do is control who your friends are,
Mm.
because free association. This is because now you're forming friend groups and you're forming social structures outside of government control. So the how the individual, the group, and the government interact, I think, is very much less clear than socialism or not socialism. So yeah, that would be my. Is that a quick response? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is helpful. Yeah, and Mary asked a question that was kind of personal about how you handled kind of maintaining external validation, which kind of more traditional cultures have a lot of external validation about how you're supposed to act when you were in the United States, without looking to brands and institutions the way that Americans often do. How did you manage that yourself?
Yeah, and this is actually somebody who took the class just mentioned that in the last day of the class. They said the longer they're in France, they haven't been in France that long. They said they noticed that people, one, they don't never ask you what you do, where you work. They really don't even ask you where you live. I mean, eventually they will, but that it's a much lower priority because they don't look for external institutions, careers, jobs, achievements
Hmm.
to tell them who you are. They want to talk to you. They're much more likely to ask, like, "Oh, what are you interested in?"
Hmm.
As opposed to "Where do you work?" Where do you work is a culturally definable status symbol, as opposed to a what are you interested in? Now it's for me to judge you, not for me to know what society would say about the job that you have. It's a very different element. And so I would say in the United States, I was odd. Number one, I've struggled with institutions, so I've never really had a lot of institutional authority. So maybe I'm just because I'm not good at institutions, I've decided that I will say that you don't need that kind of validation. But maybe that's just my own predilection. But yeah, so it was the ability. I focused, I would say, on elective tribe, on finding those people that seemed most consonant with your own concepts and ideas and outlook, and then seeing if you could make things work with them. Certainly outside the family structure, and certainly outside of any sort of career kind of idea, which is, and I can now, having lived in France for a while, I can say so much easier and natural in France than it was in the United States, because the way they measure achievement is very different. Of course, every society is going to do this, but it's just very much more personal and individual in France than it is or was in the United States.
Gotcha. And back to Ashton's question about socialism, what about social democracy in current American politics? So the squad and the kind of left of center American politics. Anytime the kinds of subjects that you brought up in this series are discussed generally in America, it starts to drift towards, are you Bernie Sanders person, or are you more of an Obama person, or so where does that social democracy idea come in?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question. I think one way to think about this is how much influence democracy has on the government, and how much do we want it to have. And that, so I don't know exactly what people mean by social democracy, but I take it to mean that they want more like people power. They want people to have more influence over government, which is to say less influence by other forces like corporate forces or religious forces or other institutional forces. So it should be, quote unquote, the people who get to influence what's happening. And one of the difficulties that the United States faces, unlike most other countries in the world, is it's a democracy whose population has increased exponentially by, our government was set up in its rough outlines and given the basic numbers, and how many, 2 senators for state at a time when the population was, let's see, 1/100th or 1/150th of this. And so if you have 400,000 people in your state and you get 2 senators and, I don't know, 20 House members, a House member for every 2,000 people, that's pretty good. Plus you have a mayor, and you have maybe a county commissioner, and you have a governor. And so, the number of elected officials to the population. But today, like, to be a California senator in a state of 30 million, right, you need 10 plus million votes. Well, that dilutes the power of each individual vote, and just dilutes the power of each individual citizen. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that institutions that were set up at a time when the population was, again, 1/50th, if that, of what it is today, and the scale was completely different. And so people complained about like the electoral college and, state representation, like senates, like Montana has a senator for every 250,000 people, and California for every, whatever, 25 million or 20 million, whatever it is. It's a big difference. And they go, wow, this isn't fair. And it's like, yeah, because this is a democratic institution that was set up along very different lines. Mm-hmm. And the overall impact, amongst others, has been to radically dilute the power of the individual citizen, which I think people often feel. So if I were to, opt for anything back of the envelope, I would say, hey, decentralization would be awesome, because what this would do is, if you put increasing amounts of power into local and regional governments, it just puts it closer to the people. Mm-hmm. Right. So if your tax money was spent locally, or a majority of it was spent locally, you would have a very, very much different relationship to your elected officials and your elected government than we do now. Mm-hmm. And it's if you look at news coverage, local versus national, it's 99-1. Right. Even local newspapers want to talk about national news rather than local news. People want to talk about the presidential election, not governor elections, even though often it's your, city people, your county people, and your state people who have much more impact on the policies and, tax structure and education structure and all this that really does influence your life on a day-to-day basis. But our focus tends to be on this highly diluted, very far away sort of federal government. And it's definitely, when people talk about states' rights, on one hand, this is often used as a shorthand for we don't want to change, right? Like, and only the federal government could make these changes, so we'll make it. So like, it's like racism as a problem, right? If you let each state vote, it's clear that we would have these very, very, baby Jim Crow would still be in effect in many states. And so the federal government steps in, where this means you have to have a very strong federal government to allow it to do that. Right. So I understand those problems, but there's also the question of, well, if the federal government has all of the power, then you feel like it. It's not just a feeling. You're correct. You have much less authority than you would than, say, if 80% of the federal government was divided up in the budget, and just handed out to the states. And they said, okay, we're going to spend 20% of the federal budget federally, and 80% we're just going to give back to the states and block grants or transfer payments or something.
Well, and those instincts seem like they go kind of counter to social democracy, and where there's an impulse to increase federal power.
Yeah, and every time you increase federal power, not every time, but broadly speaking, you're often decreasing your individual capacity to influence things, because who influences the federal government? There's not that many senators, and there's not that many House members, and there's a lot of very highly organized, well-funded interests in the world who are working on them. And so your vote is just, it just statistically just doesn't count for as much as it used to. Literally, it might count for 1/100th of what it used to. And then when you figure that it used to not allow women or men without property or black people to vote, think about that, right? So now if you were a white male voter, your vote really mattered, or at least it mattered many multiples more than it does now. Conversely, if you live in a city of, say, 500,000, if it had a couple of $1 billion from the federal government to divvy up and to spread out and to invest in things locally, wow, your school board, all of a sudden would be, you're like, wow, your school board would have hundreds of millions of dollars to spend, and you'd be like, being on the school board would be huge, and you'd be, people would be much more interested in it, et cetera, in theory.
So do you feel like people's natural instinct to move towards figures such as Bernie Sanders is sort of a mistake?
Yeah, I would say functionally it is a bit of a mistake, because and he wants to democratize at the federal level, which I get, and that's probably good. More input from the people, less input from lobbyists. That's all fine, right? So it's not saying that those are bad ideas. But think about the difference of, what if we could do this locally, right? That this is the, and it does seem to run counter to our sensibility of going, no, we want all the power in the federal government, and then we want the people to control that. Well, this is very, very difficult to pull off. But local issues, local initiatives, local boards and control, those might be much easier, more you have more authority, more say, more opportunity to interact with them.
At Bronx Guy asks a question about collectivism and individualism, and says Americans dislike collectivism, especially broad collectivism. But interesting enough, Americans also dislike extreme individualism, such as libertarians and even extreme community groups like David Koresh, kind of cult groups. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I was hoping to articulate is that I think the dichotomy between community and individual is incorrect. I think this is a false dichotomy, because we only can function as individuals within a community. Like, it's not possible. Like, it's inhuman. And so I think this is what sort of distorted part of the American worldview. And then people get desperate for community, and this drives sort of these extreme communities. Like, if people have community and they feel good about it, they don't want to join, death cults and these other bizarre, gated communities and all this. Are like, why would you do that? Like, I have a community, I feel good. But we are consistently told that community is a threat to the individual, and it can be, right? So this is not that it's not inaccurate to say that too much community rules and stuff can in fact impede on the individual. However, lack of community is also equally a threat to the individual, because one, you can't function without community, you just die. Two, you can't be healthy without community. We rely on community. And so to free us up, and the example one of the examples I like, I use a symphony orchestra or a football team, and the people go, oh, I want to be an individual, I want to be an athlete, I want to be, okay, join a football team. This is highly organized, highly, you can be an individual on a team. And people love this. They're individual on a team, and it's like, the notion that that can be more true about society, I'm not sure why we struggle with that, but we really, really do struggle with that. We think that, oh, if I were on the team, I would be a star on the team. Like, it's like, yes, you might be, but you still have to play within the context of the team. And it's like, it's that challenge, that trade-off that I think our purity is. Again, I hate to always bag on the Calvinism thing, but our drive for purity, right? To say I want to be a pure, unfettered individual, of which there is no such thing, of course, blinds us to the notion of like, no, you don't. You want to be a person who operates in a community. And I think the simplest example of this is that we rarely think of this. We're kind of blind to it, but money is a communal institution. And so one of the things that we have developed is we use money to ameliorate and to lubricate so many social interactions, so that if I want to have someone help me paint my house, we agreed socially that the way you do this is you agree to a price, and that will essentially, transferring the money will allow both of us to have met our communal obligations. If you paint the house and take the money, and I get my house painted and give you the money, we're good to go. Right? If you don't have some sort of communally accepted monetary system, which is often is very much more complicated than our system, then you have to every negotiation becomes a one-off negotiation, and that's a complete pain. And so people say, I want to be independent, I want to be a libertarian, get rid of money, right? That would be very tricky. Or back to the original question about being dependent on things, people say, oh, well, I'll save my money, then I won't have to depend on someone to take care of me when I'm old. It's like, save your money. Do you mean bury it in your backyard? Or do you mean put it in a bank? Right? So you mean put it in a bank or put it in investment institutions, hey presto, you're back to being reliant on your community, right? Like, so this is, so I really resist the community versus individual dichotomy. I think it misleads us vastly more than it helps.
Gotcha. At Nonfiction Addiction asks a question about a paradox with the self being forgotten within individualism. So they say, I think it's so true that the idea of meeting with self is not appreciated in the States. It's an incredible paradox that amid all this individualism, the self is forgotten.
So if I understand what they're saying, they mean looking inwards.
Yes.
Right. Like, yeah. Okay. So, and I would say, yes, it's amazing how little emphasis is put on this. And again, back to the example I just used from France, which is when people ask you, what are you interested in? What have you been thinking about? Right. You almost feel obligated to have been thinking about something. Not what have you been doing externally, but what have you been doing internally? And that distinction or emphasis in conversation is, everything's on a bell curve. So it's no absolutes here, but it is just heavily weighted towards, what's going on there inside there with yourself? How do you discover yourself? How do you know? In fact, this is one of the questions I often come up with in my own mind for libertarianism, is for as much emphasis as they put on being an individual and doing what you want, I want to always say, like, well, how do you know what you want? Right? Like, this is like, how do you come? Because you want to make sure if you get the opportunity to do what you want and you have this freedom and you're an individual, it's great. Like, how do you know what it is that you're going to want? And then how do you make sure that you have those freedoms and those capacities and those interests matched to your sort of socio-political environment? And as far as I can tell, they never really, like, literally never asked that question, because again, just the great paradox that they're pointing out was this notion of going inward. And that's, I think part of it is because libertarianism is a political system, and that is not a very, it sort of moves you away from the external and towards the internal. And so you're like, well, this is a lot of Taoist or Buddhist ideas that you can be free in a prison because you want to look at the inside and not at the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, yeah, we're definitely emphasized. Again, it's just back to the status stuff too. We're so externally focused, so absolutely focused outside that the internal side just not developed. We're not
Right.
interested.
Yeah, and I think our listeners will be sort of surprised by your responses to socialism because you have such a strong emphasis on community and such a strong emphasis on humanity and humane arts, and but yet your instincts aren't to move towards socialism, basically. So
yeah, one is it's just such a soft concept. So moving towards soft concepts, I'm always suspicious. If I can sit down with somebody and say, okay, what do you mean by socialism? So I'm not against the idea. It's just like then they say, oh, I mean this and this, or oh yeah, that would be great. Right? But generally, this means government structures, and it means the private or public ownership of means of production. And there's a lot of evidence, as I said in the lecture, that the private ownership of the means of production has really been productive, right? I mean, it's created all kinds of problems and confusions and complexities, but it's also been really, really productive. So I'm like, no, do we need that? If they mean cultural shared values and cooperation, then absolutely. Like this seems both good and necessary, and we have a lot of it. Which this is the bizarre thing about the United States is we just, while being by any historical standards highly culturally integrated, we pretend like we're not, and that it's somehow confusing, and that we don't like it. We have a public education system, but we're going to rubbish it, and we're not going to like it, and we're not going to invest in it because we don't believe in that kind of thing, although no one has any kind of concept how to do anything else. We have public roads and public power, and we have public sewers, and we have, you go through the list. Airports are really groovy, and we have all of these shared communal projects that we've done together as a society, and then we go, either socialism bad or we don't have any socialism and we need more. And I'm like, okay, but notice we have a lot, right? Like we pretend like we don't, but we really do. Maybe we do it badly in some ways, but nonetheless, we do a fair bit of it.
Right. Yeah, we're interdependent.
Yeah, we are interdependent already. And so what you mean by socialism, I think, is what more would you like on top of what we already have? And I can think of lots of things off the top of my head that I think would be great, but I don't think it necessarily requires the public ownership of any productive means at all.
At Con4Ot says, I think it's critical to restate that the patterns you mention in this video coincide with the transition of a production economy to a consumption economy in the US. The old models of obtaining a career do not match up with the economic model where money is being made by creation, but instead it's being made on maintaining the archetypes of the quote American ideal.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. Like the point, the last question and answer session, someone talked about oil, and that the new power generation, which is absolutely vital. This is a great point. The switch from a productive economy, as they said, to a largely consumption economy has been dramatic and significant, but it's not clear what it all means yet. Maybe another 20 or 30 years of this will give us a clearer idea. But if one of the ways to think about this is multipliers. They used to say that value came from, or one theory of value was that you got the material inputs plus labor produced a product, and then the market would help you sort out what that product was worth. And so you sort of have this interrelated sort of thing. If you think about a video game, like the cost of reproduction of a video game is functionally sort of zero, because it's just digital. Any digital good has this capacity to be not, there's power supply and storage and data storage, but relative to like a ship, it just doesn't take that much material goods to reproduce the production thing. So we can produce in some ways, almost infinite amount of certain goods. And so the question is, well, how do you get people to consume this, and how do you maintain consumption? And that is a destabilizing and very different sort of economy. However, it is not as new as you might think, because there's the parable of the bees by Dutch economist and philosopher living in London. I want to say mid 1700s.
Okay.
That might be a little late. It's the parable of the bees. You can look this up. I can't remember his name off the top of my head for some reason. In which he points just this out. He says it's the consumption of luxuries that drive our economy and nothing else. And it was hugely controversial when he said this 300 years ago, give or take. And it's still somewhat, people still seem to resist this idea. But yeah, it's been a long time since most of our economy has been driven by need, and it's more driven by consumption. And there are a lot of arguments that say that basically you have to keep people in this unsatisfied desire loop if you're going to keep them consuming. Because if people are like, no, I'm good, I don't need to buy too much today, I don't need to buy too much tomorrow, I'm going to hang out with my friends, I'm good, then your economy will just not grow. If not, it might even shrink. There's an argument being made right now that this is kind of happening in Europe, because people tend to be happier than the United States, and the happiness tends to be going up a bit, despite all the problems and surface issues. But the GDP is not growing very much. So it's like, what happens if everybody is just happy and your economy doesn't grow, right?
Yeah.
Like how do you manage for that? Like how does a political system or a social system respond to this? And yeah, nobody knows. But this we may also find this out with if we continue to go to digital goods that have no real restrictions on them, material restrictions. That what if people just get happy? They're like, hey, you know what? Like iPhone sales are not picking up because it turns out people are perfectly happy with their iPhones. Right? It's a good phone. I don't need a new phone. And so they do like designed obsolescence, and they kill your old phone. They make it so that it can't run anymore, because otherwise people just are like, no, I don't want to update my phone. I'm good. It works. I'm happy. Right. So yeah. So it introduces all kinds of weird new variables.
Yeah. At Evictus Maximus says, my first day as a senior in high school, our guidance counselor told us that if we didn't already apply for college, you were behind and losing. I got so depressed.
That was like the most American thing ever. But yes, okay, I'm sorry.
I got so depressed, I gave up and went to trade school. I agree, but it wasn't until later in life I learned I had an interest in things like philosophy. I try to look into it as much as I can, but at the end of the day, I'm still just a welder with wireless earbuds.
Yeah, one I would say, never say just a welder. The welding, amazing, great skill, great capacity. I think this is one of the problems, is there's been a great narrative of just a welder, as opposed to, oh, if you were an engineer at Google, people will be like, oh, that's very impressive, even though nobody knows what an engineer at Google does. Not nobody, somebody must know, but almost nobody actually knows what those people, like I always say, is that if people at Google just killed kittens all day, people are like, ooh, they work at Google. We don't know what they do in those buildings, but yeah, it's great. So not just a welder. Two, like this, just stay tuned. This is going to be very topical in the near future, trying to address this very issue. But being interested in philosophy is not what your guidance counselor wanted you to say in any case, right? If you said, wow, I really want to ponder the metaphysical questions, they would not go, oh, right, good for you, let's sign you up for a philosophy program. They'd be like, look, you ignorant bastard, you need to get a job, so why don't you think about law or accounting or business or whatever it is off the top of their head they think of as a possible job that would matter, quote unquote matter. And so yeah, and so I would say it's never too late, and it's and it may just take time for one's mind and interest to mature to the point where they go, Philosophy, that seems like an interesting thing to ponder and think about and to like cultivate as intellectual pursuit. And in fact, I do want to cultivate intellectual pursuits. So yeah, I do think this is a common refrain. I hear it a lot. I mean, a lot being like I get email about this basically every week. And Jeremy and I are working on a project to maybe help address this. So stay tuned a little bit. But yeah, I mean, basically, this is what my lectures are for. Is I think too many barriers are put up in our society that say it's not for you, or
Mm.
it's too late for you, or you should have done this earlier, or something like this. And I just think this is poisonous, wrongheaded, and unhelpful. That many philosophers started very late in life, indeed, because just they're not there yet.
Mhm. And do you think it would be good advice for a person like this welder to actually prioritize it? Like, welders make decent money, and maybe they could take classes at the community college, beginning with
Yeah.
101, and actually go into it? Or do you feel like maybe listen to Wes in your earbuds? Like, what's the path for someone like this? I can kind of feel this person wondering that question.
Yeah, I don't think there is a path, of course. If I said there was a path, everyone should just turn it off. Because that could be a bad sign. I've lost my mind. Uh, um, but there are many paths. So I think reading is great, taking notes, taking classes, seeing if you like those. Sometimes people have really good experiences returning as adults. I've had students in my own classes at the college, returning adult students, workers, construction guys and stuff are like, oh, this I've just always wanted to do this, and now I can. And I feel comfortable. My business is doing well enough, or something. And a lot of people, I've heard a lot of stories where they just have a very bad experience, right? Where they go, oh no. But I do think I would strongly encourage you, if this is your interest, read some books, take some notes, look at the classics. They're easy to track down, because they're there. They're available. There are communities that are interested in these things. And there's no reason not to. Even to go further than this, I would say that, academic philosophy has a whole bunch of problems. I don't want to rubbish academic philosophers, but they have a whole bunch of problems themselves. And so it's not like, oh, if I had gone to the university, things would be sorted out. Like the school I went to, Indiana University, which is I think 50 or 60,000 students now, was about 35 or 40,000 when I was there. Had, I think, something like 45 undergraduate and graduate philosophy students. Right. So this is not like it's out of tens of thousands of students. There's just a handful of bizarre people who have decided they would like to think about this. I think more people would feel invited to think about this if our system didn't do like your counselor did, and tell people, oh yeah, got to get a job, you're behind the curve, you don't know what you're doing, you don't have the right background, you got to eat, although it's not like people are starving to death in the United States because of their college educations. And so this kinds of things. So a lot of this is just nonsensical, but never, I would say never. And if you hate welding, don't weld. But I wouldn't rubbish a skill. A skill like that is admirable and valuable, and you can make money with it. So that's good if you enjoy doing it. That's but I do think that societally we do say, oh, you're a welder. Okay, moving along. I don't want to talk to you because, how smart could a welder be? Right. Like,
Yeah. But primary sources in philosophy are hard to read.
Yeah. Yes.
And oftentimes the question for folks like this is it worth it for me to pick up Kant and just sit in my bedroom and read it? Or do I really need to take that step? Not Kant. Not Kant. Okay.
Don't do Kant. I mean, please, if you want to read Kant, feel free. Like, who am I to say what you can and can't read? But,
right.
I'm not big on censorship or warning labels, but I do think this, there should be a warning label on Kant's works that say, warning, this work was written by Immanuel Kant.
Right.
Like this danger. Don't go. If you find yourself baffled and confused, it's not you. Don't feel bad by that.
So you might need context. You might need the community college 101 class.
Yeah, the community college 101 class might be a great start. Finding a community of people who are interested in these things might be a good thing. Again, this is what my lectures are basically designed to do, is to try to help introduce people to these concepts, and say, hey, these are available. Here's some background to get you rolling. But it is a tough question. It's a hard one to answer. And for people in the United States, you can go back to school later. In a lot of countries, if you miss that window, which is often at like 16, it's
Right.
extraordinarily difficult to say, not impossible, but it is very challenging, much, much less easy to go back, and to go, okay, now I want to change my mode and go to school and all of this. So I think the opportunities are much easier in the United States. Not necessarily easy, but at least they do exist in many places.
Yeah, and I think there are more people than we'd imagine who are at a place where there's enough money and free time and the real interest, and that they could pursue something ancillary to their job more seriously, but they're not quite sure how. So
yeah, and that's yes. And how is the question? I mean, literally, Jeremy, like I said, Jeremy and I have been working on this, trying to come up with at least a partial solution to this problem. So hopefully we'll have that available soon.
At God Landon asks a question about the psychedelic thought leader from the 90s, Terence McKenna, who said, we have to stop consuming our own culture. We have to create culture. Don't watch TV. Don't read magazines. Don't even listen to NPR. Create your own culture. If you are worrying about Michael Jackson or Bill Clinton or somebody else, then you are disempowered. You're giving it all away to icons.
Yeah, this is the Archaic Revival. I think that was one of his works. I can try and think of a couple of other ones. I've read several McKenna books. I think this is an incredibly valuable idea, because I'm not, obviously, I think one of the great riches that we have is access to the cultural history of our species on this planet for thousands of years. So I wouldn't say completely ignore it, but I would say that within context, generally our balance is completely out of whack. So people say, oh, how do you do research? How do you do this? What do you, and I'm like, one of the things I do is I walk a lot. And when I'm walking, I'm alone with my own thoughts, which are a reflection on things I've read and things I've seen and things I've heard. But I take a actually absurd amount of time wandering about, looking at spider webs and leaves and water, and then in kind of rummaging around in my own mind going, oh, what about this? Oh, what about that? And things occur to me, and then I sit in a coffee shop and I write them out. And yeah, I think it's a important point to think about what is the ratio of intake, processing, if you want to call it that. That would be a technical term, or just trying to digest what you've taken in, and then self-creation, self-expression, self-discovery. This back to the self point, which very good point that the person made earlier, because we are so externally focused that we don't think about the self. And the problem with this, of course, for our culture is whatever you do independently and individually is wrong. We know this because you don't have any superstructure telling you it's correct. And so only retroactively do artists become really cool and interesting. They're never cool and interesting as they're going along, right? Like this is the, retroactive justification of the artist when the rest of society says they're good, or when some other external force comes in. But we don't want to value our own production or capacity for some reason. I'm not sure why. What important people do is more important than what we do, and that's just bizarre. I like classical pianists. I like Yuja Wang, for instance, a generational talent. If ever there was one, I cannot play the piano that well. I absolutely admire her and love listening to her music. But I also need to do things that are not that, and produce my own material and do my own work, whatever that is. So yes, I would say in this case, Terence McKenna absolutely accurate. And figuring out what that ratio is for you, I think, is vital.
And at God Landon asks a second question, says, I have a question. So my read of the situation of individualism as you lay it out is a lack of recognition of interdependency. We are interdependent upon each other to survive, but we don't recognize this on a conscious level because of the historical momentum enforcing individualist attitudes. My question is, how in the history of philosophy have philosophers dealt with a problem like this, where there's a dissonance between the societal facts of the matter, huge surplus and huge webs of interdependency, and considerations that the culture that manifests to deny that, in our case, an artificial scarcity and a faux individualism? How have philosophers thought about this, or have philosophers not dealt with it because it's new, it's American?
One, I think that's a great observation. I would agree with pretty much all of that. I think that's very well stated. So, yeah, exactly. This is precisely kind of what I was trying to lay out. And one of the things I've been talking about is this, like I said, faux individualism, because we are interdependent. The question we want to talk about is what's the best way to be interdependent, not are we interdependent or not. Like, again, that's that false dichotomy I was talking about. So I really like this question. I'm trying to think about these philosophically has been difficult in history, because many of the philosophers, particularly in the early cultures, were somewhat isolated, right? They didn't have exposure to a lot of other cultures. And this is why it was in contact with the North America and South America and the Caribbean islands, and these sorts of interaction with the old world, the new world and the old world, spurred a lot of Enlightenment thinking, for this very reason that you point out, where they're like, hey, some of our assumptions, some of the stories that we tell ourselves, basically, we have a narrative that doesn't line up with how we're actually living, are false. And it may be, this is like, again, speculation on my part, take it for what it's worth, that we're living in a time where we're starting to recognize that the narratives that we tell ourselves are false. So I'm trying to think of who would be good examples of this historically. Interestingly, and we don't have the work, I wish we did, Aristotle in ancient Greece had collected apparently like 70 different constitutions from Greek city-states. So they could compare and contrast all the different ideas of how you could govern society. And then, of course, you would, trying to figure out which one of these was the best. And so Aristotle is clearly thinking along these lines. And again, the Republic, which I keep mentioning, was an attempt for Plato to do this. He wanted to say, hey, the way we're living, what we're thinking and what we're saying do not line up at all. Mm-hmm. We need to rethink this. Hegel's philosophy of history is very suggestive of this, but he doesn't really address it directly. So yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of any of the big ones that were really directly commenting on this, but it is a good subject. I'm sure there has been, and it's not occurring to me at the moment.
Yeah, Socrates was pointing out hypocrisy fairly often.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this was the Socratic method. If there was a Socratic method, which is possible, it was this notion of hypocrisy, but not in a pejorative sense. It was the sense that we feel like we know what we're talking about and doing, but when we actually try to interrogate it, what we find out is we don't know. Mm. And so it's not like people were purposefully being misleading or lying. It's that they were inadvertently just believing, like, oh, I know what courage is. Okay, is this courage? And like, oh. And then at the end of the dialogue, they're like, I don't know what courage is anymore. Shoot. I thought I knew what we were talking about. And it would be like, if you could get to a Socratic dialogue, maybe that's the best example, thanks, Jeremy, is ask people, oh, what do you mean by individualism? And then is this individualism? Is that individualism? And then by the end of it, they're like, ooh, maybe I really do mean interdependence, right? That would be kind of the Socratic method on that one. But I'm trying to think of more contemporary. Well, Rawls was trying to do this. I'm not a huge Rawls fan, but he was certainly, this was one of the things he was trying to demonstrate, is that our narratives and our social structures don't line up very well. There's the other guy, Consilience. Who did Consilience? Is that E.O. Wilson? So many names, so many books. Consilience is an attempt to think our way through that one. But what I would say is what happens with philosophy as a general, is that a rule or is a pattern? Let's call it a pattern. Is philosophers create or amplify values that are either nascent in society or new, or they see coming, or they think are important and valuable. And when a society gets new values, then those values have this transformative thing, because what we value really at a base level drives so much that goes on in our culture. And so you can think about someone like Marx. For all of, again, right or wrong is generally not that helpful with understanding philosophy. It's more, what was the impact and why? And it's clear that his impact was the alienation, great word, that was inherent in industrial, and the birth of industrial society was so great that something had to give. And so his harnessing of that into an intellectual, very, somewhat coherent, like not even that coherent, which is a shocking thing for it to be so powerful, idea of culture resisting this force took on, massive power, because people felt the need for this value. And so they grabbed it. So I'd say it usually works that direction. Like philosophers try out a bunch of ideas, some of them rise to the surface, and then those are the philosophers we think are super important. There's Voltaire's ongoing critique of kings and religion. It's hard to find in his works because it's everywhere. It's just like he just slowly brought everybody along with him to the point where, kings just kind of seemed silly one day, almost, right? It was almost like one day people went, a king is a silly thing. Like, why do we have kings? We don't need kings. And so it was a big shift in the fundamental perception and value. So I think philosophy tends to work a little more that way.
Mm-hmm. At Katra asks, if Newton was an unsociable loner, was he unhappy despite doing something he enjoyed?
That's a good question. I've actually read 2 biographies of Newton, and it doesn't seem like, it's hard to judge from the outside. Is someone happy? But he seems someone who was very satisfied and content as long as he was left alone to do his work. And his work was so spectacular that people tended to just create a superstructure around him that allowed him to work and get on with it. And so you're like, okay, so I think he was relatively content with what he was doing, because he just kept going. I mean, he just kept writing and running experiments and, becoming the head of the treasury, making the coinage in England. He did all kinds of crazy things, and he seemed to have that drive to do, and he did a lot. So I would say, again, hard to judge from the outside, but he did seem, sort of a bit of a misanthropic loner, but a contented misanthropic loner, like Schopenhauer, right? He liked being a misanthropic loner.
Yeah, and he was focused on the quantitative. So I think the question is also focused on, can you be interested in these things that maybe make people more isolated, aren't as qualitative, but still be more or less a cheerful loner?
Yeah, and I think it is, and that's why I say, when I talk, talking about community and interdependence and all this, it's clear that people are on a bell curve. Like when they created monastic movements, they were popular, so it suggests that people were like, that sounds good, I want to try that out, right? Like it's like there was some pent up demand for monasticism, which is weird to think about, but hey, for some people this seems like a good. And you can look at thinkers or musicians or artists or leaders throughout history, and you do find some that are like Kant was essentially a monk who he lived increasingly monk-like existence when he had the opportunity to. Mm-hmm. And so, Leibniz seemed to be a bit that way. So it just strongly variable. The human expression of this is, some people need less of that. interpersonal interaction. Doesn't mean that, but notice again, back to the, probably beating this horse to death, but that notice that Newton, while being a loner and an individualist and probably, well, not probably, pretty much a misanthrope, he lived in a communal setting. I mean, he was essentially in a monastery of sorts. And so for most of his life. And so he was definitely supported by a community that made sure he had what he needed so he could keep doing his obscure mathematics and other projects.
And at KSV asks a similar question about Cormac McCarthy. Or it's more of a comment, actually. They say, McCarthy lived 45 years of his life writing at the Santa Fe Institute, where he was known as a sociable guy who talked to the students and faculty about whatever the interest of the day was. I say this not to call the man a hypocrite or that you were misled by his writing, but only to point out that McCarthy himself valued community and the exchange of ideas among peers.
Yeah, this is why I guess it's a good point. I'm not that familiar with his biography, although I do know he was very technology averse. I think for the reasons that, like 2 people ago, talking about how we take in too much from the outside. I think he had probably with him, he's very bright, he understood this consciously and built his life to avoid that. If not, he understood it sort of naturally and just did avoid it for his own purposes. From what little I know from him, my sense of him, and this could be completely wrong, is that he appreciated and felt community and enjoyed community as someone who kind of felt the presence of the other America, right? Like I think this is why he could embody it so well, is like, he's like, oh yeah, community is super, super important. Really like it. Here's the alternative, right? Like that notion of going, oh, here's what's on the other side of that. Here's why it's so important. Here's why I want to be an institution that allows me to have this sort of communal interaction and with people. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, the inner lives of people are difficult to track down if you don't have like lots of diaries and letters. And I have not read a bunch of his diaries and letters or I'm sure there must be some big biographical work on him that would help ameliorate this, because it is really hard to see or understand the internal psychology of people at times.
Mm-hmm. The next question has kind of a conspiratorial feel to it, which is relevant because of the times that we live in now. At True Catholic 1 asks or says, what is being discussed is likely a part of a manipulative agenda. Quote, they want people to be isolated and fighting with each other. That way they will never become a target. So the idea is that this individualism is somehow to keep the masses occupied so that the larger forces can go about their business.
Yeah, I'm always very suspicious of the dichotomy of this. I mean, clearly there are lots of social forces, particularly now with algorithms and all this, that try to unsettle us and try to shape our attention and try to capture our attention and capture our spending. And like if you search Google now, it used to not be this way. I've lived long enough to see Google completely transmogrify that. If you type in something like, oh, book by Cormac McCarthy, it's as likely to pop up another author you might also be interested in. But I actually typed in Cormac McCarthy because I wanted Cormac McCarthy, and what's popping up is a bunch of other crap. Like, we're all familiar with this. Distraction and noise, and so that is not a conspiracy theory. That's absolutely going on. Back to that point that somebody else made, hence the need to sort of cut a lot of that out so that you can focus on what it is you actually care about, what's coming from you, what are you creating for yourself and in your environment. But is there some global conspiracy to do this? If so, it's been running for centuries. There's an Italian author, it might have been Italo Calvino, but I can't remember, who said, given the choice between community, love, family, and a microwave oven, young people the world over have chosen the microwave oven. Meaning you can see exodus from the rural America, from rural almost everywhere to urban, has been this powerful draw. And if you want one thing that has disrupted society and social systems and communities, it has been that dramatic and rapid urbanification, because most urban spaces simply weren't built for and do not support traditional communalism. And so on one hand, people have moved to a place where it's very hard to implement, and they moved from places where it was maybe still vestigial or still rolling strong, but then of course when nobody's there, it sort of destroys it. And so this is, by the way, and if there is a conspiracy, you can look at some place again like Italy. I think Spain may have done something like this at one point. They were going to try and tax young Italians who lived at home, particularly in southern Italy, because it was a drag on the economy, right? Because they're like, oh, they're just living at home, they aren't getting their own apartments, they're hanging out with mom, they like mom, their friends come over, they don't need a lot of money, so they're not working too much, the weather's good, right? So they had this problem of I forget, they had a name for it. I should look this up. I'll try and find it. Of young people, and by young I mean like into their 30s and 40s, who are like, oh, I like living with my folks, I like the community I live in, I like my friends around here, I have a little bit of a job, but mostly I hang out with my folks, we go places together, I hang out with my friends, my girlfriend lives down the street, my boyfriend lives one block over, he's going to move in with me with my family, or I'm going to move in with him with his family. And they're like, we're good. And but this actually, as I mentioned earlier, destroys your economy. And this destroys. I said this is a drag on your modern economy, which wants you to be working, making money, and consuming. Other things are bad. So there's a lot of social forces that drive us to consume and to be individualistic, whether they are organized in the sense of like, oh, this is a plot, or whether it has just been this feedback loop that's gotten started, this flywheel that's just flying, and now everybody just recognizes it and goes, oh yeah, we need people to consume and spend, so we're going to advertise, we're going to do this and that, and make them do this, because if not, your economy is going to struggle. Mm-hmm. It's a real thing. Always remember, the best thing for you, the GDP of your country, is to get into a car accident on your way to cancer treatments. Right? Like, this is great, because you're going to spend a lot of money in medicine. You're going to spend a lot of money getting your car fixed. The other person is going to maybe have to buy a new car. This is great. From the standpoint of GDP, this is spectacular. From the standpoint of the quality of your life, yeah, these are different things. And I think this is one of the problems that we struggle with is, and if you want to call it a conspiracy, I said this is the part I would buy, is that our narratives are so strongly shaped by our understanding of the modern economic idea, which is just sort of a myth, but that, making money, buying things, working for the GDP, getting promoted, being an important person, these make your life good. And that narrative is so strong that we go, oh, well, it doesn't matter where my friends are, it doesn't matter what they're doing, is, where I grew up doesn't matter, I need to be important places, et cetera, et cetera. And that is really the challenge. If that narrative starts to fall apart or decline, then I think you'll see a big shift in values. Like back to the question before about philosophy. If there is a philosopher who has articulated a clear alternative message that gets people to begin saying, no, I am going to stay where I was, or I'm going to move to another small community and set up have friends there and really dig in and set my roots up, that would have a transformative impact. Actually, it would destroy people's country's economy. So it'd be very interesting to see what the response would be.
So it sort of feels like a conspiracy, but maybe there's not an actual little room of leaders doing that.
I don't believe in the little room of leaders, except for social media and stuff. Those algorithms absolutely run as a conspiracy by a few people who design them. So if that's a conspiracy, great. But I think generally speaking, the overall form is this discovery of consumer-driven growth. And then well, how do we make people do this? How do we get them to do? How do we encourage it? that and that narrative that goes along with it. More than anything, it's such a voluntary participation system it's hard to even go. Is it conspiracy when everybody volunteers? And again, back to the point that the person made earlier about distraction and outside forces, Terence McKenna, in 1984, I've said this before, one of the key points he makes is there's this screen that buzzes all the time. There's these klaxons that go off all the time. There's all these notifications that come in all the time. So you can't have a coherent series of thoughts because of the distraction and the noise and the klaxons and the buzzing. And that the government makes you do this. And what we've done is we've said, no, I'm going to pay a bunch of money so that I can have a smartphone that buzzes and makes noise and interrupts me, every 5 minutes, and it rings, and other people's smartphones ring. And I'm sure if anybody's been into a modern classroom, they've had this experience of like this, at times it can be this continual rolling sequence of distractions. But we pay for that. Like, we want that. We think this is a great thing. I frustrate people I know because I just don't have my phone on ever. It doesn't buzz and it doesn't ring. And so once or twice a day, I'll go, oh, I should check my phone. And then it's always got like 4 calls from people. And they're like, why don't you ever answer? I'm like, because my phone doesn't ring. Because if it rings, it makes noise. And that drives me bonkers. Like, it's a bad thing, but it does. But social expectations, this is very frustrating to people. And so I can say, if it is a conspiracy, it's super efficient because people get pissed off at you when you don't live this life of constant distraction, because you're like, hey, I called you 10 minutes ago and you didn't respond. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't know where my phone was 10 minutes ago. So sometimes I go a couple of days without looking at it. And then that's socially probably pushing the boundaries of what's allowed. But yeah, you do pay a tax. I understand this. But yeah, the distraction economy, the isolation economy, it's just like it's the logical extension of what we've been told our whole lives. If I can do me better and get more for me and make it mine and keep other people away from it, then I win. I don't want one large pizza that I can't eat. I want 2 large pizzas. I don't want 2 large pizzas that I can't eat. I want 4 large pizzas. And there seems to be no end to the number of large pizzas that you should have to eat, like, for some reason. Like, no, if you have a large pizza, what you want is some friends. What's the point? What's the point? There's no point. It's just going to make yourself sick instead of happy. Yeah.
At Crunkle asked a question about social trust in America compared with in Asia. So they say there's little or no social trust here, and often there's conflict between the people and with officials, mistrust in police, schools, politicians, the penal system, the medical system. If there's any social trust, it's very thin and not at the same level of some East Asian countries where it's common for stores to have stock out front neatly presented with little or no vandalism.
Yeah, I think this varies on where you are in Asia. I would say it's interesting. I think China runs almost on zero on social trust. Like, it is personal to an extraordinary degree. Like, business in particular runs on a series of personal interactions. If they don't know you, they just don't trust strangers, essentially. So I think it's an interesting one, because off the top of my immediate reaction would be to say, no, we have a high level of social trust, shocking level of social trust. But we have, crime problems and we have lots of problems, but we do have a relatively high level of, like, we put money in banks. Which in a lot of the world, that would be crazy. Why would you put your money in a bank? That's the dumbest thing you can do. One, you have to trust the value of your money. If you live in a hyperinflation economy, you absolutely don't trust that, which is almost a way of voting for your government. 2, you don't trust your bank. They're just going to steal your money. So yeah, I would say we're a relatively high social trust society. But again, I think we've created a great deal of distrust with our abstract institutions. Maybe that's the way I would conceptualize this, is we tend to trust those things that we interact with regularly, like things we know. We're like, oh yeah, no, it's good. I trust my local bank. da 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 da. But when we get abstract, we're like, oh, I don't trust the government that much. I don't trust these other forces that much. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where we are on a relative social scale. But we're a fairly high social trust country on global standards. But exactly where I don't know off the top of my head.
At Jasper Locke asks or says, the Benthamite calculus persuades you, if you take humanism's core tenet that all human life has intrinsic value, as axiomatic. When you don't, it's ludicrous and absurd. And even if you don't accept it, that doesn't automatically mean that a single individual life has equivalent value to another. Shakespeare and Newton, etc., their lives have more value than several million regular lives. And then someone followed up on that comment and said, that's psychotic.
So first, is this an accurate assessment of Benthamite? If you do not buy the core tenets of humanism, notice the title of my channel is Humane Art. So, you know, hopefully that makes it clear that I'm pretty much a hopeless humanist. That I do believe in the intrinsic value of human life, that you're wonderful just because you exist. In fact, I don't think people can really augment the value of their existence. I think you can, you know, run it down if you be an axe murderer or torture people or something like this. I tend to think like, okay, maybe we need to kill you to protect the rest of us. But otherwise, you know, humans are good and wonderful just because they exist. And that makes us, you know, plenty damn good. But this is clearly a historical and philosophical value argument. You can't prove it. I would argue for it, obviously, but you can't prove it. What's going on here is there a variability in the value of lives of different individuals? Historically, this is what people believed. So this is why an aristocracy would exist. An aristocracy exists because you thought that certain people were born better than other people. And they absolutely thought this. The clergy thought they were better. In Europe, they had different laws. Like you were subject to different laws. In many parts of Europe, an aristocrat could kill any non-aristocrat, and there would be no punishment for this because you're an aristocrat. You know, it's fine to kill peasants. That's just what they do. And so this notion of inequivalency between individual value is historically the standard. Mm-hmm. The humanist revolution was to say, no, pretty much everybody is pretty valuable. Again, if you're an axe murderer, not so much. If you're doing other horrible things, not so much. But basically, everybody is pretty equally wonderful. What's interesting is then the idea of going, oh, well, people who make huge contributions to society are more important than people who don't, like a Shakespeare or a Newton. And my pushback on that is I just say I never know why we should believe that. I mean, I think it's great that Shakespeare existed, but most people have never heard of Shakespeare, and most people have never read Shakespeare, and the vast majority of people have never been to a Shakespeare play. So it doesn't seem that important to me. I mean, I like it. I'm glad he existed, but I'm glad lots of people existed. So this notion of creating differential value is historically what we used to do. Humanism has argued that no, we should probably give pretty much everybody pretty much equal value.
Mm-hmm. And we're wrapping things up here. We went a little long on this one, but it was covering a couple lectures, and the conclusion. Last couple are sort of lighter. This person was trying to wrestle with their own takeaway from the series. And they said, I feel there's not much we can do on our own, but practice living modestly and happily without expectations of materialistic acquisition. Would you kind of agree with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's huge philosophical schools that would suggest you are absolutely correct. But I'm curious about the word modestly, right? So there's always this is a very American conception, right? Either you're out there striving to be great and awesome, and or you're just living a quiet, modest life, right? Like this is like you're just gonna kind of lower your expectations. And it's like, well, how about living immodestly well, right? Living so well it's embarrassing, right? Like you're just enjoying yourself so much that it's sort of an affront. They use this rude health, somebody who is so healthy and so vibrant that it's sort of offensive to other people, right? Like this concept. So I'm like, hey, live immodestly well. Don't think of it as modesty. Think of it as you deciding what makes you happy, and then pursuing that at great and overwhelming length, if you so desire. And then we associate again, saying, "Oh, but I'll just not worry about material goods." This is the interesting thing, right? It's like, "Oh, I'm just going to relinquish my interest in material goods, and then that will free me from it." And it very well may. It could be freeing and liberating. But again, I think gives material goods too much power in some ways. I mean, we like material goods. We want to have shelter. We want to have clothes. I sometimes think if you look at around America, it's so much crap. That's why the part of the nihilistic materialism concept to me is, if you're a materialist, you wouldn't buy so much crap. But Americans love, love, love shit. I mean, we just consume absolute crap at such a pace it's hard to imagine. And it's like, why would we do this? Why wouldn't we go, I don't want to eat with a plastic fork on a plastic plate. That's just unpleasant. Right? A materialist says, don't give me plastic and plastic. I want, a ceramic plate and a metal fork, because A, environmentally probably more friendly, but B, it's just more pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
But no, we're not. We're happy to have lots of crap. So I'm always torn on the materialism thing, instead of maybe just say, oh, what kind of material things would bring joy to my life, and then don't care about the rest of it. And living joyfully, pursuing your own interests in your own space and your own time, is that modesty, or is that just fucking awesome, right? Like this is joy of its finest sort. Yeah. But again, because of our cultural narrative, we want to say, oh, well, they've decided, they aren't going to move to New York and become mayor or something. I know whatever the ostensible win would look like. And therefore they're just, again, you just don't really count, right? You're not an important person. You're not valuable. It's back to the other question. That question is actually born in the notion of, oh, it's only people who really make a contribution who really count.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't, you're just one of the billions of unwashed, creepy masses. Who cares about them? They can all die or not. But it's only these 5 people that really matter. I would argue, as a good humanist, like, no, the people who are having lovely lives and enjoying themselves wherever are as equally valuable, and in some ways more valuable, than people who might be torturing themselves and setting bad examples and perpetuating unhealthy or unhelpful narratives.
Mm-hmm. And that last question was from @mistaken for bacon, and the final question is from @Goya Gokao, and it was, where was the Louisiana lecture? You had mentioned at some point you're going to have a dedicated one.
I mentioned Louisiana at length when I compared it to the Netherlands, didn't I? Didn't I do that?
I think that's right. I think
Okay.
it just wasn't called the Louisiana lecture.
I'm sorry. So if you missed that one, it's the concluding lecture, I think, is the last lecture, before the one preceding this one. Had a moment there where I'm like, I could have sworn I talked about Louisiana. Like that's one of those, you got to check your own sense of reality. Don't scare me like that. Yeah. Okay. So I did do a whole section on Louisiana. So I hope that answered some of your questions, because I do think the comparison between Louisiana and the Netherlands really, it's amazing, the difference in how 2 resource rich cultures with different histories just decide to divvy up those resources totally differently, that has amazingly different social outcomes for individuals, right? Like that, it's just shocking when you compare it down the lane. And the funny thing is, people, and I've actually had this conversation with people, which made it spring to my mind why I decided to do it in the lecture, have said, well, of course, the Dutch had all the natural gas and they had the oil and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, look at Louisiana, more oil, more natural gas, more money. And yet, no, it turns out money and natural gas and resources are not the answer. There's other things going on in the distribution of these goods and in the narrative about how they should be distributed.
Well, thank you, Wes. Yeah, can't tell you how grateful we are for this series. Yeah, I really liked it, and there were many appreciative comments in here as well. So thank you so much.
All right, and thanks everybody, and thank you, Jeremy, for doing this. This is experiment number 1. I think we'll have more of these coming up. And yeah, stay tuned. The question about going back to school and studying philosophy is very apt, because we're again, Jeremy and I are trying to come up with a how do you address just that problem. So coming very soon indeed. And I appreciate the questions. Keep them coming, and thank you very much. Thanks again, Jeremy.
Thank you, Wes.